You're at week 4 of Capstone. Congratulations. I know it seemed insurmountable perhaps at the very beginning, but now you've read a bunch of things and you're ready almost. I can just imagine people saying, I'm not fucking ready for this, but anyway, you are. You're just about ready to do your lit review, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to week 4 of Capstone. So, a lit review. You have actually done this many times, even if you haven't called it that, in other classes, I'm sure, or I hope. And you've also read many lit reviews by now. Again, they might not have been called lit reviews or literature reviews, but that's probably what they were. And so all you need to do is think about what you've been reading, continue reading, of course, I'm going to say that every week, but now it's time to start organizing the main ideas from what you've been reading. So I'm going to just stick to that example of, let's say, women in video games. Imagine that that's my research project for this. So you've started to break down what your main topic is and the smaller components that help to build that larger theme, right? So for me, for this example, it's gender and sexuality. What is a woman? How are they represented in general? What is a video game and how are video games represented? How do they work? Where are they? What do we know about them? What do scholars know about them? And then representation. How does representation work? What are some theoretical ideas that I'm using to understand representation? So that's my imaginary project, and it actually relates to some things I have been working on. That's why I picked it. But so just now, this week, I want you to start putting together a literature review. And what I recommend is doing headings and subheadings and sub-subheadings, and that will help you write it. And then when it's time to hand it in, you can probably delete almost all of it. It would be totally acceptable to just have the heading literature review, but if it helps, you can keep the subheading. So literature review, and then video games could be one subheading, and then you move on to gender as another subheading. But as you're writing and as you're reading, you want to obviously do those two things. I would recommend doing them kind of back to back. So read an article and then write a little bit of literature review. Read another article, write a little bit of literature review. But hopefully you've been reading, you've been maybe highlighting, you've been taking notes, and now all you have to do is put them in place. You can organize it sort of like a tree from the roots to the branches that are more defined in terms of the topic. So you got the big topic, and then it branches into all these little things, or you can maybe organize it in a different way. In fact, if you want to do a diagram, like a visual representation of what you're looking at and what you're studying, that's always a good idea to start like that. But yeah, I would just not worry about your final product and only do headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings. So again, so how are women represented in video games might be the question I'm working with to start with, and then I want to think about video games, and then I want to break that down further to maybe the history of video games versus, let's say I'm studying a specific kind of first-person shooter. So I want to do genres, so video game genres, the history of video games, studies of video games, video game players or demographics, and these might all be subheadings or sub-subheadings in my literature review when I talk about video games. And then once you've exhausted that and narrowed down all the different things that you might want to talk about, you can put in the information, right? Or just start to put in information. It won't come to you, and I don't expect you to have this like master plan that is all ready and set up. What I expect you to do is think, who plays video games? Then you go out and study that a little bit and you realize, okay, the percentage is this and the average age is this and the breakdown is this. And then you just put that into the appropriate subsection and then you cite it and you're almost done. It just involves some editing later. And then you think about, okay, well, I'm talking about gender. So what is gender? Who has written about gender? Boom, you write some of that down in that appropriate subsection. And then maybe you have a history of gender studies, and it doesn't have to be an inclusive history of all gender studies, but what are some major articles or books or ideas that have come in the last few decades when we think about gender, and what are you using to think about gender? So you write that down. and you cite your sources, right? And then you basically just keep filling in little blanks that you create in these spots, and suddenly you have a lit review. And then all you really have to do is synthesize it all, which sounds like a big thing, but you just have to say, look, I'm studying this topic, I'm breaking it down in this way, maybe by theme, or maybe by chronology if you're doing a more historical study, and then that's it. I might edit that out, or I might keep it to show how to show how this works when I'm recording. But yeah, that's all I want you to do. I heard somewhere, I was reading that Zizek, if you haven't seen Zizek, Google him. I'll maybe put a video of him. He always looks like he's on cocaine. I don't know if he is or not. But according to some people, he's a brilliant guy, and according to others, he's insane. And maybe he's both. I know I've enjoyed what I've read from him, and he talks a lot about psychoanalysis. But anyway, he has this line where he says he never writes. What he does is he thinks about stuff and takes notes, and then he jumps into editing because suddenly he has hundreds of pages that he can just edit. And it sounds weird, but it's also, I realize, what I do as well. I don't think about sitting down and writing very often. What I do is I say, well, I just read this cool thing on Batman, let's say, and I'm going to write down some of the stuff I know, and I'm going to make sure I cite it so I can go back and look at that book or look at that article later. And then before I know it, there's this whole sort of random assorted set of facts and history and context related to Batman, and then all I got to do is move things around and put them in order and maybe do some subheadings, and suddenly I have an intro chapter or a literature review. And yeah, if you do this well, that's all you don't have to write it all. All you have to do is put notes, take notes, and sort the notes into certain orders that make sense, and then you actually just move on to editing. You've never had to write, you've never had to think about writing. You have all these notes that you can then make a little more sense of or make a little more coherent. Anyway, that might sound really intimidating, but look at all of the articles that you've read. Usually, they don't necessarily say it, but usually they start with a literature review. And so you might want to find the one that you like the most, or the one that you thought was the best in terms of its explanation, its organization, or its writing style, and then basically mimic it. You don't want to copy it, but what you might want to do is think about how it's structured, how it's set up, and then do something very similar for yourself. We can talk. You can always contact me and we can talk about your specific situation, your specific topic, but I think it's really valuable to just make headings and subheadings and sub-subheadings, and later you'll delete them, but as you're writing, as you're putting notes in, you can say, okay, well that goes to the history of video games and specifically this area, and so you put that in the appropriate subheading, and then yeah, suddenly you can move it up and down depending on what you think is best, and you have a literature review and you never had to write. You just took a bunch of notes and then you edited them. That's my advice. You will get through this, you will have a great literature review. Just try to keep answering all the questions that you had at the beginning or that you think people might have when you introduce a topic, right? So what is a video game? How popular are video games? How are people using video games, and how often do they use video games? And as you find these things out, you just cite your sources and you put in that information, and suddenly there's your lit review. Easier said than done perhaps, but yeah, it'll work, I promise. I'll see you next week. Cheers.